Alright, in this video we're going to be talking about implicit typing in C#. And implicit typing is a way that the C# compiler can infer the types of local variables without you having to explicitly declare them. And so yeah, first of all though, implicit typing has nothing to do with dynamic typing. That's the #1 misconception that opponents to implicit typing have. In certain languages, that is true. If you do not declare a type, it will use a dynamic type instead. In C#, that is not true. Implicit typing has nothing to do with dynamic typing. If you use implicit typing, you are not creating any runtime overhead. So let's go ahead and see what implicit typing looks like. And the best example for implicit typing to kind of showcase the kind of time it can save you, and most importantly, the readability it can save you, is using something like a dictionary. And a dictionary has two generic parameters, so let's go ahead and specify them. What they are is irrelevant in this example. And we'll go ahead and instantiate it to a dictionary. So this code is actually very redundant, and I would even go as far as to say that it's not as readable as it could be, mainly because we have a lot of vertical screen space being wasted, or horizontal screen space being wasted, sorry. Now, if we were to instead use implicit typing, what we would use is the contextual var keyword. And the reason I say it's contextual is because just like the yield keyword or whatever keywords that were introduced after C#1 are all contextual, where the var keyword is only a keyword when used as a type for a local variable. So let's go ahead and write another dictionary. And you see here in the second example, we are actually providing the exact same amount of information than we did in the first example. Instead of specifically declaring or explicitly declaring our variable type, we are telling the compiler to infer it based off the expression we passed in the variable declaration.
Which really means that that is our very first rule that we have to keep in mind when using implicit typing.
Exactly. That leads us into the most important thing you need to realize about implicit typing is that you must always actually assign that variable in its declaration. So for example, with explicit typing, this is legal. We have a variable called x, and it is an integer. It isn't assigned to anything right now, so you can't actually use it until you assign it or specify it in an output parameter. But this, for example, is not legal. The C# compiler will, although it could theoretically do this, it will not look forward to any of their code, to any of your usage in order to infer the type. You'll see that implicitly typed local variable must be initialized. So that's just a basic rule that they put together when they were building language. But if we go ahead and assign this to something such as 0, we now not only have an implicitly typed y variable, but it's also definitely assigned at this point. The second limitation of implicit typing is you cannot use multiple variable declaration syntax with it. So for example, this is legal. This is legal as well. However, this is not legal, neither is that. And this isn't legal mainly because it breaks the first rule. This isn't legal because basically the C# compiler team, when they introduced this theoretical syntax, they got kind of split internally about how to interpret this code. One group of people says that because multiple variable declaration inside of C# instead of this syntax will always require that every single variable declared is of type specified. Therefore, this implicit typing should determine how to get or how to coerce every single variable through implicit conversions to the same type when they're declared. The second group said that shouldn't be the case. Instead, if I were to say y5 equals 10.5, y5 should be a double and x5 should be an integer. Because of that divide, they decided to completely disallow the syntax in order to make two valid opinions about how the syntax should work irrelevant, so that there's no confusion. So those are the biggest things about implicit typing. Of course, the main reason why implicit typing was even introduced into the language was with the introduction of anonymous types. So if I were to say this, or to declare an anonymous type, you see that this is legal only because I'm using implicit typing here. Implicit typing is the only way to actually reference a anonymous type. And because anonymous types are created by the compiler during compile time, there's no way for us to statically refer to them, or rather not statically. There's no way for us to statically and explicitly refer to these types, as they don't even exist before the program is compiled. So implicit typing allows us to do this. Now, of course, we could do object anon or dynamic anon. Either one would work, but in both of those cases, you lose the static typeness of this variable. And so yeah, as far as rules and why things were created the way they are, that's about it as far as implicit typing.
Well, there is one more that you indirectly covered, and that was at the very beginning of this video. You had mentioned that they are used for local variables within a method, meaning that they cannot be used as field members.
Right. They cannot be used as field members, as property members, as return types, as argument types, or parameter types, or as anything other than a local initialized variable declaration.
Very good.
Now, finally, the last thing to kind of think about as far as implicit typing is the philosophy behind it. And there's a lot of debate in the C# community it's slowly going towards implicit typing. And the reason is that implicit typing, even in cases where there's a potential loss of information. And let me demonstrate what I mean by that. If I were to create a reference type up here called person, his definition is irrelevant. And then if I were to create a method that returns that person, but the name of this method carries no actual description of what this method returns, I could say this, and this statement has no semantic value whatsoever. But the thing is implicit typing, if you were to use it religiously, you would notice that there is actually ways to make this code relevant, or to make this code actually more readable than if you had just done this, which is a bit of a cop-out due to poor naming. Mm-hmm. So if I were to rename this method, instead of get data, get person, and then rename this local variable person, at this point, adding a type or adding a explicit type to this statement would really just be redundant, and that's actually a way that you can enforce better design on your code. If you use, like I said, if you used implicit typing religiously, you will be forced to give your variables and your methods better names. And there's never an instance where you will be forced to use implicit typing while having poor names, because you can always make names just as semantic as if you were to declare the type.
Right.
And the another most important thing, though, is that oftentimes, again, this gets really deep into the philosophy of implicit typing, is that really types in a language don't matter very much. It's not so much about types as it is the flow of information between statements. And a lot of people get hung up on types where they really shouldn't. However, the implicit typing allows us to not worry about types while also still working in a statically typed language, as opposed to if we were working in a dynamically typed language, which has its own set of issues.
Okay, yeah, that was very well said. So is that pretty much everything you want to cover here?
Yeah.
Okay, fantastic. Well, ladies and gentlemen, that will wrap things up for implicit typing. Thanks a lot.